for me to hold track on this path, it's important to contemplate about, is it a view of seeing it from a perspective of awareness, or a perspective of the mind. So I kind of lost track.
Yes. Okay.
But when I look from perspective of the awareness, yes, I know. But
yes. Okay. It's not possible to view the world directly from awareness's perspective. Awareness needs the finite mind to know the world. It's exactly the same when you have a dream at night. When you have a dream at night, you don't, let's say you dream that you're of a Caribbean beach. You don't view the Caribbean beach from the perspective of your mind asleep in Amsterdam. In order to view the Caribbean beach, your mind has to simultaneously dream the Caribbean beach within itself and enter into its own dream and locate itself in its dream as a separate subject of experience from whose perspective your mind knows the inside of itself as the outside world. Your mind cannot view the Caribbean beach directly. It needs the agency of the dreamed character. It's exactly the same with consciousness. Consciousness cannot view the world directly. Why? Because consciousness is infinite. And there is no room in the infinite for the finite. If the finite were to appear in the infinite, the finite would displace a little bit of the infinite's infiniteness, and therefore the infinite would no longer be infinite. So infinite consciousness cannot know the world directly. It has to dream the world within itself and simultaneously enter into its own imagination as a separate subject of experience from whose perspective it sees the inside of its own mind as an outside world. And each of us are the separate subjects of experience in consciousness's dream, through whose agency it sees itself as the world. The difference between our mind, our finite mind, and infinite consciousness is that our mind can only have one dream at a time. We always locate ourselves as one person in one place, Jane on the streets of London, or Peter on the Caribbean beach. But infinite consciousness can locate itself as numerous separate subjects of experience within its own dream, and each subject of experience, that's each of us, gives itself a different viewpoint of its own mind. And the reason why we all see the same world is not because there is a world outside consciousness, independent of consciousness. It is because our view of the world, it is because the world is each of our minds have a different view of the same consciousness. In other words, the universe is consciousness. And each of us are viewpoints in consciousness of the inside of consciousness's mind. So that is why, and from the perspective of the separate subject of experience in the dream, the world will always appear to be something outside of itself, because the separate subject of experience experiences in subject-object relationship. When you have a dream, you're the character in your dream. The world is a multiplicity and diversity of objects from the perspective of you, the character in the dream. From the perspective of you in bed dreaming, there is not really a multiplicity and diversity of objects and self. There is no real subject and object. In other words, there is no real duality. That's why this is called non-duality. There are no real subjects and objects. It's all your own indivisible and unlimited mind. And there are no divisions in your mind. The subject and object are just means through which your mind perceives itself as the world. So the subject-object relationship is simply the mechanism through which consciousness manifests itself as the world. It is the tools, the subject-object relationship is the tools of manifestation, the tools through which the potential that lies dormant in consciousness is manifested as the world. But the subject-object relationship is an appearance. That's the way things seem to be from the perspective of the separate subject of experience in the dream. It's not the way things really are from the perspective of the one who really knows pure consciousness. But consciousness has to sacrifice itself or forget itself or overlook itself. It has to consent to dream the world within itself and then enter into its own imagination. This is enacted in so many traditional myths, and in fact in the Christian myth, that God became man. The infinite consciousness has to sacrifice the knowing of its own being and consent to become a temporary finite self in order to know or manifest its potential as a world. But the price it pays for that manifestation is that it loses its knowledge of itself. It seems to become a temporary finite self, and that is why in the hearts of all finite selves there is this wound, this feeling, I have been cut off from my source, I long to go home, which is the longing for happiness. It's why all separate selves suffer, because separation is suffering. The feeling of being something temporary, finite, limited, is accompanied inevitably by suffering, which means by the desire to go back to my fullness, to know myself again as I truly am. And it is that impulse to go back to ourselves as we truly are that dictates the behavior of all 7 billion of us. The only difference between those of us here and most people is that those of us here, we have been failed so often by the objects of experience that we are no longer seeking happiness, seeking to return to ourselves via the acquisition of an object or a substance. We're here because we just want to go directly there. But what we long for here is exactly the same as what all 7 billion of us long for, which is simply to be divested of the sense of separation and to know ourselves again as the fullness of consciousness, which is another name for peace or happiness.